Good morning and happy Monday. I'm Mandy McLaren, Courier Journal education reporter, joined this morning by our columnist, Gerth, and political reporter, Phillip Bailey. And we are here today to really just give you a recap on what happened over the weekend down in Western Kentucky. The three of us were out at Fancy Farm. For those, Joe, that for some reason have lived in Kentucky and don't know what Fancy Farm is,
What it is the annual picnic at St. Jerome Catholic Church in Fancy Farm, Kentucky, which is a little hamlet about 8 miles from Mayfield in far western Kentucky. And since the 1930s, at least, when Happy Chandler was running for lieutenant governor, he started going down there and speaking on the stump down there at the Fancy Farm picnic, and it became a tradition. He would go there every year, and other politicians start to follow him. For years now, it has become kind of the preeminent political event in Kentucky. Virtually all politicians go, at least who are running for statewide office, go at least in the years that they're on the ballot. Some of them go in other years, and it has become a situation where it started off where the politicians would speak and a few people in the crowd might heckle them and yell at them and say things to them, but it has gotten to the point where the entire other side spends virtually the entire speech screaming at the politician. Like when McConnell spoke this time, everyone on the Democratic side was yelling "Moscow Mitch," and it is kind of a gauntlet that the politicians have to run as a rite of passage. And you know, the Courier Journal has been covering it each and every year since 1966, and other newspapers from around the state we go there. We had Rolling Stone magazine there this year, so it was quite the show.
and if you're running and you don't show up, that's not a good move, right, Phillip?
I don't think I've ever seen a statewide candidate on the ballot who would skip Fancy Farm. Fancy Farm is the kickoff of the fall campaign. It is basically a requirement, and one of the reasons I think that it has such a beloved sort of stature in Kentucky politics is it takes people out to the purchase region, part of the state that often feels ignored because it doesn't have necessarily the coal fields that Eastern Kentucky has. It doesn't have the major media market that like Louisville or Lexington would have. It often feels ignored, so you have this one time a year where, particularly with Senator Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, the governor, et cetera, have to come out there oftentimes. So I think it provides those folks a space. But Joe is right. I mean, the event has evolved in such a way that it doesn't look like it did in the past when Happy Chandler first went there. It really has become a professional political event in a lot of ways, and that's mainly because of Senator McConnell. In the 1980s, when there were very few Republicans in Western Kentucky to speak of, he would bust them in and have this sort of professional, raucous crowd. And that's happened pretty much ever since then, is that you have this sort of orchestrated circus down at Fancy Farm.
So going into this past Saturday, political circus is a great description. What was the context? What are we looking at here? Who was going to be there, and what were you looking for?
Well, certainly the main event is the top of the ticket. Andy Beshear, the Attorney General, the Democratic challenger, who's taking on Governor Matt Bevin, Republican, in this year's gubernatorial race. This is probably one of the more bitter rivalries we've seen at Fancy Farm. I talked to Mark Wilson, who's the political organizer for the picnic, which, by the way, is at St. Jerome's Catholic Church. It is a fundraiser for the Catholic Church, by the way. That's an important thing to remember in all this. Andy Beshear and Matt Bevin, according to Mark, have one of the more bitter rivalries that he's seen, and he can remember some of the best ones. You know, Ben Chandler and Ernie Fletcher back in 2003. He can go back to, Dee Huddleston and back to Wendell Ford. I mean, some of these great rivalries that you've seen over Kentucky's political history. I think it's very personal between the governor and the Attorney General. And you also saw some other races that are deeply personal, particularly the Attorney General's race between Daniel Cameron, the Republican, and Democrat Greg Stumbo, who are trying to succeed Andy Beshear, who obviously can't run for re-election because he's running for governor. So those were the two, I think, main speeches that I was looking forward to, and they certainly provided that. I mean, the governor basically used a prop and brandished this giant fundraising invitation from the Beshear campaign, saying, look, Andy Beshear is taking money from abortionists, right? He's leaning heavily on national issues, given his own impopularity or unpopularity in the state. That was pretty clear from that stunt, I think, that the governor is relying on those national issues.
And one thing I was kind of interested in, or very interested in actually, was this was McConnell's first big appearance in Kentucky since he had been given the nickname Moscow Mitch. And so I wanted to see how that went over with the crowd. I wanted to see how he reacted to the shouting that he was certainly going to get. And
it did sort of throw off his Amy McGrath jab there. He was saying, oh, Amy McGrath, but he messed up initially. He said Andy McGrath.
Right. And so it was interesting to watch him come and deal with that pressure that he's now feeling for the first time in forever.
Right.
And so this was old hat for these two guys. For me, it was my first fancy farm. Didn't really know what to expect other than it was going to be hot, and you saw from some of those photos there of the governor and the attorney general that we all got a little bit sweaty. And so leading up to the day, people arrived there very early. The speeches don't start until 2 o'clock.
Right.
Like, this is more than just a round of speeches. It's a whole day event.
Yeah, and you know, they have bingo games there. They have they cook essentially 9 tons of smoked pork and mutton, and hundreds of pounds of lima beans and corn, and just about anything that you could hope for with it. And it's a huge fundraiser for the church.
Yeah, and one thing, Phillip, you and I had talked about is this was your 8th fancy farm,
right?
How the audience maybe has changed, especially in the past couple of years. You're seeing more? I mean, I cover education, more folks out there really talking about education, public school science.
Right. I think one thing that's happened is American politics has become more orchestrated and manicured in the sense that politicians often go to where they hear cheers. That's Democrats and Republicans alike. And they go to their labor unions, or they go to the Chamber of Commerce, or they go to the police unions, or they try to insulate themselves. Even the media that they talk to oftentimes reflects their own ideology. Fancy Farm is one of the few places where the politicians face the opposition. Literally, they see them. And Mandy, as you know, teachers have been itching to give Matt Bevin a piece of their mind for a long time. And he has skipped Fancy Farm. Governor Bevin is not a fan of Fancy Farm. He's made that known since he was a candidate for governor. He thinks it sort of shows the worst of our democratic process. But you saw those teachers. I mean, when he took the stage initially, it was deafening. I mean, I've heard boos, of course. Senator McConnell gets booed. The Bashirs get booed. Alison Grimes, when she attended in years past, was booed heavily by Republicans. But when Governor Bevin took the stage, I couldn't hear anything. It was just like a giant, monster of boos. And I think that reflects the cantankerous relationship between the governor and the education community. I think that comes down to the governor has a selling point. He can talk about putting money into the pensions. The problem is that he often steps on his own message with some of these controversial comments about teachers. And even this summer, when asked, do you regret any comment you've made about educators? He said, absolutely not. So that only adds fuel to the fire. And I think other Republicans have noticed that. They distance themselves from the governor often. And I think it was last year or one year where Congressman James Comer, went up on Fancy Farm stage and thanked teachers, just to make it clear, like, hey, Republicans like teachers too. And I also noticed that, Congressman Comer at that GOP breakfast didn't mention the governor once. And there's some worry amongst some Republicans. I talked to a Republican pollster who says that they think that Bevin's going to lose Louisville by 80,000 votes. And there are Republicans who are at Fancy Farm telling me, essentially, that they're worried about those down ticket races. They're worried about Allison Ball running for treasurer. They're worried about Mike Harmon for auditor. They're worried about Ryan Quarles for ag commissioner because of that wave that could be coming through against Bevin, but there could be a down ticket ballot for Democrats. So there is some concern on the Republican side.
So one thing Fancy Farm is known for, other than its barbecue, are the zingers. So we're going to get into all of that, and I know Phillip and Joe definitely have some opinions about who had the best lines of the day. But first, let's take a look at some of the highlights.
Just for the record, the only Russian flags I've ever seen in Kentucky are all over here, just saying.
Thank you, St. Jerome, and thank you, Fancy Farm. And thank you to the governor for finally showing up. I guess we got to thank the Koch brothers, too, for letting him.
They handpicked Amy McGrath. Oh, I mean, McGrath. She sends her regrets. She's still working up an answer on Brett Kavanaugh with her friends at MSNBC.
I am the only candidate in this race with Western Kentucky roots, but wait a minute. I'm the only candidate in this race with any Kentucky roots.
It's just too bad our governor is the Christian Leitner of Kentucky politics.
Greg Stumbo is like the milk that you have in the back of your refrigerator. When you open it up, it smells terrible.
One thing we love about Fancy Farm is trying to decide who had the best and funniest one-liners. So I asked the organizers if I could spend my time just playing Matt Bevin's rap song.
So look, there's also the other side of the stage. I'm going to spend about as much time talking about them as Kentuckians will voting for them this November. None.
But I have to tell you, it is no coincidence that Fancy
All right,
Farm
so,
happens
some
during
zingers there. When you think back to Saturday, what are the lines that you remember?
Certainly Daniel Cameron's crack about Greg Stumbo being the old carton of milk. Greg Stumbo is a veteran of state government, a former attorney general, a former House Speaker, someone who's been in the legislature for a number of years. Comparing him to the old carton of milk certainly, I think, was meant to contrast the age difference between the two of them, Mr. Stumbo being 67, I believe, and Mr. Cameron being 33. Jacqueline Coleman really impressed me. When you're the lieutenant governor, your main job on the campaign trail is to be the attack dog. And she went into Governor Bevin and his running mate, State Senator Ralph Alvarado.
Yeah, her list of potential names for charter schools
yeah.
I thought was a really nice touch and worked well.
Yeah, and I'll give the Attorney General credit. I mean, Andy Beshear is known as a wooden candidate. He's known as someone who's very stiff on the campaign trail. He sticks to the stump speech. You know, you often hear him say this isn't a race about left versus right, it's about right versus wrong. And at the Democratic dinner the night before, that's usually where the elected officials, at both of their dinners and their breakfasts, they often preview their jokes. And it seemed, at least, from the dinner that Andy Beshear was just going to stick to a stump speech. So he had low expectations already going into Fancy Farm. I think he exceeded those. I mean, he had some pretty interesting and funny lines, particularly the line making fun of the governor's rap, saying, your staff lets you do that, and you fired Janine Hampton's folks. Yeah. I think that inflection was certainly a good showing for the Attorney General.
Yeah, and you know, his dad never was great at giving policy speeches, but he was good at Fancy Farm,
Right.
except for 2011 when he went down there and really laid an egg.
Yeah.
But so I mean, he gets it honestly, I guess.
Yeah, and I think you got to give him credit for
yeah.
for that. I think that John Haley Conway, who's a Democrat running for Ag Commissioner, certainly. When he grabbed the microphone and started walking around the stage, I had never seen that before. I was like, oh, he's like a stand-up comedian here.
Yeah.
I think he had a good performance. I think, again, Senator McConnell didn't do poorly. That's the other thing, and Joe mentions this all the time. At Fancy Farm, you really don't win, it's just you don't lose. So I think, for example, Governor Bevin broke even. I think, he didn't hurt himself. I think he just revealed that his campaign is relying heavily on national issues. But I would say,
and primarily the abortion issue.
Yes,
I mean, that's what his entire speech was about, just about.
Right. As a reminder to those Republicans who voted against him in that primary, the 39% or so who voted for State Representative Robert Goforth, that look, I'm one of you. You should remember that I'm a very pro-life Republican. But I would say Jacqueline Coleman, Daniel Cameron, and Andy Beshear probably had the best day in Fancy Farm as far as the zingers and one-liners were concerned.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. And as far as losers, I don't know necessarily that there were any, because I didn't see any of the mistakes that you think are going to come back and haunt the candidate in the future. The closest that came with Greg Stumbo, who spoke, who told a joke that Ronald Reagan had told years and years ago.
You ripped off the Reagan joke.
Yeah, and you could, if Daniel Cameron wanted to, he could hit him for plagiarizing the joke. But at the same time, Cameron has so much to go after Greg Stumbo on as far as his personal issues. I can't imagine that he would want to get off track on some plagiarism thing when there are more things out there to talk about.
And I would say that I was a bit disappointed in the Secretary of State race. Both candidates, both Heather French Henry, the Democrat, and Michael Adams, the Republican, for different reasons. Heather French Henry didn't really give a Fancy Farm speech. She just basically said a lot of nothing. Like, she basically said all sides, both sides, every side had a good speech today. Michael Adams, I don't think his joke really landed well. He was mentioning all these controversies, and at the end he would have everyone yell, "Oh, Henry," in reference to the candy bar, which you really didn't get until after his speech where he was passing the candy bars out. Maybe he should have thrown the candy bars out while he was speaking. I don't know.
How many people even know what an old Henry bar is
I
now?
didn't,
I mean,
yeah.
they did when I was a kid, but
Right.
that was when Henry Aaron was playing baseball.
Exactly.
And, you know.
It was very dated. So I give them both bad marks for that. And there were some other, the lesser known candidates like Sherry Donahue and Michael Bowman, the people who this is their first time. But then again, Daniel Cameron, this was his first time on the stage. Yeah. Jacqueline Coleman, this was their first time on the stage.
Yeah, I didn't think Bowman was horrible. I thought.
Because the Republicans kept saying, "Who are you?
Yes.
Who are you?"
Yeah, I thought Donahue struggled terribly.
Yes, she did.
She really did.
And I want to go back to what you brought up a couple minutes ago about Republicans and the down the ballot issue that they're concerned about right now. Can you go back a little bit into that? Because I think for our readers to really understand what's at play going into November, that's just helpful context.
Right. I mean, look, we have all the statewide races up for election this year. And traditionally, everyone knows the Republicans and the Democrats both know that the governor's race is the top of the ticket. The concern is that your lesser known candidates, or at least your down ticket candidates running for treasurer, agriculture commissioner, running for auditor, that they don't have as robust or large of a campaigns as the governor's race does. So they can sometimes get washed away. Adam Evelyn, for example, a Democrat who was a state auditor back in 2015, he still to this day feels that Jack Conway's performance as the Democratic nominee for governor was so poor that that's why he got washed out by Mike Harmon in that race. Some concern among some Republicans about some of their incumbent candidates, because Republicans were really hoping this year, after retaking the House for the first time in nearly a century, that they were going to be able to nab up all of, if not all but one, of those statewide constitutional officers. And they're still hopeful of that. Particularly, Republicans are very centered on the Attorney General race. They haven't had a Republican Attorney General in Kentucky, I believe, since the 1940s.
And Cameron's got some national attention as well.
Right. I mean, Daniel Cameron is, not only is he trying to make history as the first African-American Attorney General, he is former Senator McConnell's former general counsel. He and Senator McConnell are very close. As one McConnell protege told me, Daniel Cameron gets to go to the tailgate with the senator. So that's a very close bond relationship. Usually, Mitch McConnell, Joe, leaves after the second speech or the first speech after his own.
Right.
He stayed. McConnell never stays for Fantasy Farm. He stayed all the way until Daniel Cameron's speech to watch Daniel Cameron's speech.
And then got up and left.
That shows you the importance of that relationship and how close the two are. And certainly was why Daniel Cameron was in the Oval Office of the White House a week ago and met with President Trump and got a direct endorsement from President Trump. I don't believe Trump is endorsing any of the down ticket candidates in any of these other races in Louisiana, Mississippi, but he's endorsing in the Kentucky Attorney General's race, and he's endorsing Daniel Cameron.
Looking forward, we're thinking about how many days we have until the election?
About 93, 92 or so.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's 92 days to win this race or to lose it. Let's start with losing it. What could Governor Bevin or Attorney General Beshear do that's could really harm them come Election Day?
Well, for Governor Bevin, it's every time he opens his mouth, it could be a potential controversy. I mean, he is sort of his own worst enemy in that regard. Many Republicans believe this race should have been an easy win for a governor with the policies that Governor Bevin has: right to work, charter schools. The issues that he's behind are certainly lean more to the right, as the state leans more to the right. But Bevin's unpopular numbers make this race much closer than it should be in a lot of Republicans' minds. For Attorney General Andy Beshear, worry about the national. I mean, more and more, as the Democratic Party is a more progressive left-wing party nationally, it is out of step with a lot of Kentucky Democrats, particularly in rural areas. And he often gets drawn into, or at least asked about, these national issues that his party and others are speaking about at the national level, and he's sometimes unwilling to take a position, sometimes at all.
And another thing he has to worry about is allowing Bevin to define him as a candidate. The Republicans went a long way in doing that by running ads early in the election cycle after the primary, and you saw that reflected in poll numbers that showed him dropping down to about even with Governor Bevin. He has to get up on the air, and he has got to define himself in such a way that people are going to look at the Bevin ads that will certainly come and come hard after him, and make people think, maybe he's not that bad of a guy, because he is going to be painted as a horrible person by the time this election comes around.
Anything that either Beshear or Bevin need to be doing, places in the state where they need to be focusing to get those votes that could push them over the edge if it's a close race?
If you're Governor Bevin, I think you have to pay attention to southeastern Kentucky. That area, that stretch of counties that Robert Goforth, your state representative who challenged Governor Bevin in that primary, who got about 39% of the vote, those counties and district areas that he lost, I think he has to focus in on there.
And did he not go straight over to Harlan? Right
Yes, right after Fancy Farm, Governor Bevin went straight to the Black Jewel protest out in Harlan, out in there in Cumberland, and was wearing no pay, no coal, right? Trying to embrace that movement as he's been taking hits from Attorney General Beshear, who's argued that his labor secretary or labor cabinet secretary needs to be fired because there was an issue of them not enforcing the law to make sure those miners were paid by their company. So he certainly felt the heat and the need to rush out there to the Black Jewel protest and make himself seen and make himself known who his position was. But those areas I think Governor Bevin needs to pay attention to. Western Kentucky will certainly come out heavily for him. I think Andy Beshear is certainly not going to leave alone and abandon those rural sites. But Democrats are betting on huge margins out of Louisville. I mean, that is well known. Governor Bevin's approval rating in Louisville is somewhere between a hypodermic needle and a sewer rat. I mean, it's not good here for him. Yeah. And Republicans know that.
And one thing that Andy Beshear needs to do, he also needs to focus on the 1st District, 1st Congressional District. That is Jamie Comer, and Bevin and Comer do not get along very well at all. And Andy Beshear's roots are in Dawson Springs in the 1st District, and he needs to focus on that area and try to convert some of those Comer backers who don't like Matt Bevin and may just go ahead and switch to the Democratic Party.
And this is where politics is about relationships, right? James Comer, who lost the Republican primary to Matt Bevin back in 2015 by only 83 votes, the two of them have continued that rivalry throughout Governor Bevin's first term. So Andy Beshear has his father, former Governor Steve Beshear, very popular governor who left Kentucky's office, who expanded Medicaid, who was a Democratic Southern governor, his surrogate out in Western Kentucky. Who is Matt Bevin's surrogate out in Western Kentucky? You naturally would think it would be James Comer, but as we mentioned, Comer never mentioned Governor Bevin during those speeches. The two of them sat next to each other and were cordial, but the question is, can Andy Beshear convert those Comer Republicans who have an affinity for James Comer, who's a former state rep, former ag commissioner, who's beloved in that part of the state? Can he convince them that, look at the bad relationship between your guy and the governor. You know you're going to have a relationship with me. Comer's main argument in his conversations with me on the record about the governor was, the governor doesn't speak to me. He doesn't speak to anyone in the delegation, really. And Andy Beshear's argument could be, look, I'll talk to you. I'll at least return your phone call.
And Beshear needs to also focus big time on Louisville and Lexington and get out the votes in those two areas, because without huge margins coming out of Fayette and Jefferson County, he can't win.
Yeah.
One thing that I would be remiss to not bring up right now is what happened over the past weekend in Texas and Ohio. And we just listened to the president speak about the mass shootings in those two spots. And, there was one thing that did not come up at all during Fancy Farm was any mention of gun control, though it's been something that's affected Kentucky within the past couple of years. And, it's a topic that is, I think, very difficult in the state for both Republicans and Democrats to tread in a way that is not going to lose some votes somewhere. So in the next couple of months here, do you think that either of these candidates are going to speak out at all with anything involving guns?
Oh, after it cools down, I think probably Matt Bevin will continue to say how much he is in favor of the Second Amendment. It's going to be third rail for Andy Beshear. He doesn't want to touch the issue because it's just not a winner in Kentucky.
Governor Bevin, in the aftermath of the shooting in El Paso, talked about it being a spiritual crisis in the country. He has often said, whether it's shootings here in Louisville or out in Western Western Kentucky and Marshall County, where 2 high school students were killed. He has often said it's either video games or a corrosive part of our culture. Andy Beshear shared his condolences in his statement yesterday. No speak or conversation about any gun restrictions. And again, Kentucky is a very pro-gun state. I think most people in this, I mean, the part of the state that we were in.
I mean, from my coverage, you do have a lot of parents that are
Right.
extremely concerned. So
Right. I think that's certainly
is there a
true, yeah.
chance there for Beshear in particular, since he would?
No.
No.
I'll answer
Okay.
for you ahead of time. No, because if we looked at the coverage from Marshall County, some of those students talked about how they were supporting gun control and they were speaking out, and they were met with a backlash from their own community. I mean, again, Kentucky is a very pro-gun state, and for folks, particularly out in rural areas, I mean, after the shooting in Dayton, Ohio, when I was driving back to Louisville with my editor, I was in a corner store, and there was a gentleman in the store buying some coffee who had a gun holster, right? I mean, like, just publicly brandished in the store. He and I had struck up a conversation. You know, in his part of the state, in his part of the world, guns are a part of his culture, right? He shot guns, he said, when he was a child, 11 years old. He grew up with guns. He doesn't live in this world where there's perpetual gun violence, and he looks at it as taking away his rights. And I don't think you've seen any Democrat outside of John Yarmouth, who represents Louisville, ever take up a position of, let's have stricter gun laws. I think Representative Harris out in Eastern Kentucky surprised everyone, a Democrat, when he spoke to that. But again, I think the NRA has a pretty tight chokehold in the state legislature. And I think that most Kentuckians, when you talk to them about guns, will say, look, I grew up with them, and you need to deal with mental health issues and those folks before you talk to me about what I should and shouldn't do with my firearms.
But don't let the politicians confuse you about the issue. The issue is guns. Those are what are killing people.
And one thing I will point out, that whoever is our governor come January will be working with a legislature that does need to fund this year's school safety law. So right now, that is something that is obviously related to what happened in Marshall County and just across the country with shootings at schools. And right now, Republican and Democratic lawmakers have pledged that they are going to find money to that law, which includes increasing school safety procedures and infrastructure and SROs. But right now, there is no money there. So whether it's a Governor Bevin again or a Governor Beshear again, we'll see what happens there. We're going to wrap things up here. If you are interested in catching any of those Fancy Farm speeches in their entirety, we now have them all at courierjournal.com. You can check them out there. We'll also have continuing coverage throughout the next 90 days of this election. Stick with Phillip, stick with Joe. We'll have some more from our Frankfurt Bureau with Tom Loftus. And if you have any questions, send us emails, find us on Twitter, and we appreciate you joining us this morning. Have a great week.